Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling PFAS, sometimes called forever chemicals, and we're going to try to unpack exactly what that means. We've got scientific reports, government documents, historical timelines, all to help us break this down.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here is we're talking about over 12,000 different chemicals
Wow.
that are man-made and that have been designed to do things like repel oil and water.
Which is why they're in so many products, right? I mean, I was reading about how PFAS are in everything from nonstick cookware to firefighting foam.
Yeah, you've got things like Teflon, stain-resistant fabrics, even some cosmetics.
It's kind of alarming how much we're exposed to without even realizing it.
Well, and that's the thing, the very thing that makes them so useful, that durability actually comes from their chemical structure. It's a carbon-fluorine bond, which is incredibly strong.
Oh,
It's one of the strongest bonds in organic chemistry.
so they don't break down.
Exactly. That's why they're called forever chemicals, because they don't really break down in the environment.
Okay, so they're everywhere and they last forever. That doesn't sound great. But how are these chemicals actually getting into our bodies?
Well, you can have direct contact with products that contain PFAS, of course, but I think the bigger concern is what we call bioaccumulation. It
Bioaccumulation?
essentially means as PFAS move up the food chain, they become more concentrated.
So like a little fish eats some contaminated algae, then a bigger fish eats a bunch of those little fish, and then we eat the big fish, and by the time it gets to us, the concentration of PFAS has been like magnified.
Exactly. And there have been studies in coastal ecosystems that have actually shown this in action, and they call it the trophic magnification factor.
Wow.
And it's not just in fish.
Right.
It happens across the entire food web.
And one study found that even a single serving of freshwater fish could significantly increase your blood PFAS levels.
It's concerning.
Yeah, especially for people who eat fish regularly.
Yeah, and it really raises questions about the long-term health effects of this exposure.
Because, I mean, we're seeing studies that link PFAS to a wide range of issues, right? Like everything from certain cancers to immune deficiencies to hormone disruption.
Yeah, you see a lot of different things.
Some of the findings in these reports are pretty startling. For example, a 2023 study from Mount Sinai found that high PFAS exposure was associated with a 40% decrease in the chances of a successful pregnancy.
And then you have the EPA.
Yeah.
They've issued warnings about PFAS levels above 70 parts per trillion, which they say indicates potential danger. And of course, we have to remember that fetuses and children are especially vulnerable.
Oh, yeah, to the effects of these chemicals. Okay, so we've established that these forever chemicals are in our bodies. They're linked to some pretty serious health issues, and we're exposed to them through various pathways. It's starting to feel a bit overwhelming. Is there anything we can do to get these things out of our systems?
Well, that's where things get interesting. There's growing research on the potential of blood donation as a way to detoxify from PFAS.
Blood donation. I've never heard of that. How does that work?
So remember how we talk about PFAS binding to proteins in the blood?
Uh-huh.
Well, when you donate blood, you're essentially removing those PFAS-laden proteins from your body.
So it's like a direct removal of the chemicals. That's fascinating. But is it actually effective?
Well, there's promising research suggesting that PFAS levels decline when direct exposure to the chemicals stops.
Okay.
And blood donation, while not widely accepted or recommended yet for PFAS detoxification, it's an area of active research.
So it's not like standard thing yet, but it's promising. It's good to hear that there's at least some hope that there might be ways to mitigate the effects of these chemicals.
Exactly, and it highlights the need for more research and development in this area, especially given how widespread these PFAS are in our environment.
Well, before we get too deep into potential solutions, let's take a step back and understand how we got here. The historical timeline we have paints a pretty disturbing picture.
It does. It reveals that companies like 3M and DuPont have known about the potential dangers of PFAS for decades, yet they continued production.
And the sources even mention that the Trump administration attempted to suppress a damaging report on PFAS, specifically involving Nancy Beck.
It's a stark reminder of the influence that industry can have on government policies, even when public health is at stake.
It's a bit unsettling to think that these companies knew about the risks, but chose profit over people's well-being.
That's why public awareness and pressure are so crucial in pushing for change.
Absolutely. But speaking to change, what are some of the things being done to address this PFAS crisis?
Well, on an individual level, there are steps you can take to minimize your exposure.
Like what?
The sources mention things like filtering your water, choosing PFAS-free products, and even exploring blood donation as a potential detoxification method.
And on a larger scale?
On a larger scale, there are efforts to regulate PFAS production and use, as well as research into developing safer alternatives.
So there is hope for the future.
There is hope, but there's still a long way to go. We need stronger regulations, corporate accountability, and a fundamental shift in how we think about chemical production and use.
This deep dive has definitely been eye-opening so far. But before we wrap up part one, I want to turn to you, the listener. What are your thoughts on this issue? Have you been personally affected by PFAS contamination? Let us know in the comments below.
And stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve deeper into potential solutions and explore what the future might hold for these forever chemicals.
Welcome back to our deep dive on PFAS, those forever chemicals we just can't seem to escape. Before the break, we were talking about taking action, like what can we actually do to address this issue?
Yeah, and it's a tough one because it's such a multifaceted problem. There's no magic bullet.
Right.
But there are things we can do both individually and collectively to at least mitigate the risks and push for change.
So let's start with individual action. The sources mention things like choosing PFAS-free products and filtering our water. Are those actually effective strategies?
They can definitely help reduce your exposure. Like when you're shopping, you want to look for products that are specifically labeled as PFAS-free.
Okay.
Especially for things like nonstick cookware, stain-resistant fabrics, and cosmetics.
So reading labels is key. What about water filtration? How do we even know if our water is contaminated and what kind of filter do we need?
Well, PFAS contamination in drinking water is a growing concern.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy to know if your water is affected. Testing can be expensive, but some municipalities provide information on their water quality.
Okay.
So you might want to check with your local government, but
Uh.
if you're concerned, using a certified water filter that specifically removes PFAS is always a good step.
Okay, the sources mentioned a few different types of filters like granular activated carbon filters and reverse osmosis systems. What's the difference? And which one is more effective?
Well, both granular activated carbon and reverse osmosis are effective at removing PFAS.
Okay.
But reverse osmosis tends to be more comprehensive in terms of removing other contaminants as well.
Oh, okay.
It's a bit more expensive,
Makes sense.
but it might be worth it for peace of mind.
Yeah, for sure. So we can try to limit our exposure through consumer choices and water filtration. But what about the PFAS that's already in our bodies? Is there anything we can do about that?
Well, we talked earlier about blood donation as a potential detoxification method.
Right.
And while more research is definitely needed, it is a promising area.
But you also mentioned that it's not widely accepted or recommended practice yet.
Right.
So should people be rushing out to donate blood specifically to get rid of PFAS?
I wouldn't say rushing out. It's important to talk to your doctor
Yeah.
before making any decisions about blood donation for this specific purpose.
Okay.
They can assess your individual situation and advise you on the best course of action.
So it's not like a DIY detox solution.
Right. Not yet, at least.
Got it. Are there any other potential detoxification methods being researched?
There are a few promising avenues being explored.
Interesting. Like what?
Some studies have suggested that certain dietary changes, like increasing your intake of fiber,
Oh, okay.
might help your body eliminate PFAS more efficiently.
Interesting. So a healthy diet could potentially play a role.
And then there's also research looking into certain supplements like chlorella and activated charcoal,
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those.
which might bind to PFAS and help remove them from the body. But again, more research is needed to confirm their efficacy and safety.
Yeah, always good to be cautious. Okay, so there's hope for the future, but a lot of these solutions are still in development. It seems like individual actions can only go so far, though. What about the bigger picture? What needs to happen on a societal level to really tackle this PFAS crisis?
You're absolutely right. Individual actions are important,
Yeah.
but systemic change is crucial.
Yeah.
We need stronger regulations, corporate accountability, and a fundamental shift in how we think about chemical production and use in the first place.
Okay, let's break that down. What kind of regulations are we talking about?
Well, governments need to set stricter limits on PFAS production and use.
Okay.
I mean, we've seen some progress in recent years with bans on certain types of PFAS, but we need more comprehensive and enforceable regulations across the board.
But we've also seen how fierce the pushback from industry can be. The sources highlight how companies like 3M and DuPont have fought tooth and nail against regulation for decades. How do we overcome that?
Well, that's where public awareness and pressure come in.
Right.
The more people understand the dangers of PFAS, the
Right.
more they're going to demand action from their elected officials.
Right.
We need to make this a priority for policymakers.
So it's about raising our voices and making sure this issue is actually on the agenda. What about holding corporations accountable? They've been profiting from these chemicals for years, knowing the potential risks.
Oh, absolutely. Corporations need to be held responsible for the contamination they've created.
Yeah.
We need stronger enforcement of environmental laws, and we need to demand that these companies invest in cleaning up contaminated sites and developing safer alternatives to PFAS.
The sources mentioned that 3M paid a $10.3 billion settlement for water contamination.
Yeah.
Is that enough?
I mean, it's a significant sum of money,
Yeah.
but it doesn't erase the damage that's been done.
Right.
And it's just one company. We need a systemic approach that holds all companies accountable for their actions.
For sure. You mentioned a fundamental shift in how we think about chemical production. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we need to move away from this regulate after the fact approach to something called the precautionary principle, which basically means thoroughly assessing the potential risks of chemicals before they're even widely used and released into the environment.
So being proactive instead of reactive.
Exactly.
But that requires a totally different mindset, both from industry and from regulators.
It does. It requires a commitment to sustainability.
Yeah.
And a recognition that we can't just keep using and discarding chemicals without thinking about the long-term consequences.
Right.
We need to prioritize human health and environmental protection over convenience and profit.
It's almost like we need a paradigm shift in our relationship with chemicals.
I think you're right. We need to recognize that these substances don't just disappear when we're done with them. They persist in the environment and they can have lasting impacts on human health and ecosystems.
It's a sobering thought, for sure. This deep dive has certainly been eye-opening.
Yeah.
It's clear that the PFAS issue is complex and multifaceted, but it's also clear that there are things we can do to address it.
I agree. It's a challenge, but it's not insurmountable.
Right.
By working together, we can create a healthier and more sustainable future for ourselves and for generations to come.
What does the road ahead look like for these forever chemicals?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I think one of the most promising avenues is research and development, specifically finding safer alternatives to PFAS.
We touched on this a bit in part 2, but let's go a little deeper. Like, what kind of alternatives are scientists looking at?
Well, there are several interesting developments. I mean, for example, in 2002, a French company called BioES actually launched the first fluorine-free firefighting foam called EcoPol. And then a few years later, a 3M chemist in Australia actually developed a fluorine-free foam that met international safety standards for putting out jet fuel fires. So, creating effective alternatives is definitely possible.
So it can be done. That's encouraging. It shows we don't necessarily have to rely on these harmful chemicals. What other areas of research are looking promising?
I think the development of new materials is a really exciting area. Right now, scientists are exploring materials that can mimic the desirable properties of PFAS, like repelling water and oil, but without the negative environmental and health impacts.
Right.
This is a field that's really rapidly evolving, and I think we're going to see some major breakthroughs in the next few years.
That's really good to hear. But what about all the PFAS that's already out there in the environment? Can we actually clean up this mess we've made?
Yeah, remediation is a crucial piece of this puzzle, and it's a big challenge.
For sure.
The sources mention various methods being tested, like things like granular activated carbon filtration, reverse osmosis, and even bioremediation, which uses microbes to actually break down PFAS.
So there are options, but it sounds like they all have their limitations, and I imagine some of these methods are pretty expensive.
Cost is definitely a factor, but as technology advances, we're likely to see more effective and affordable solutions. And, we have to weigh those costs against the cost of inaction, the potential health problems, the environmental damage that PFAS can cause.
That's a really good point. We can't afford to ignore this problem. But even if we can clean up these contaminated sites, that's only one part of the solution, right? We also need to prevent further contaminations from happening.
Absolutely. Prevention is key. And that requires a fundamental shift in how we think about chemical production and use.
Okay, so what does that look like? How do we shift our thinking?
Well, I think it starts with moving away from that regulate after the fact approach
Right.
to something called the precautionary principle, which essentially means thoroughly assessing the risks of a chemical before it's widely used and released.
So being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly. And that requires a change in mindset, both from industry and from regulators.
Totally. We've talked a lot about the big picture, but I want to bring it back to our listeners. What can they do as individuals to be part of the solution?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. The more you know about PFAS, the better equipped you'll be to make informed choices and advocate for change.
Right. Read articles, watch documentaries, listen to podcasts like this one, and share what you learn with others. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to issues like this.
You can also support organizations that are working to address the PFAS crisis. There are groups out there advocating for stricter regulations, pushing for corporate accountability, and developing those safer alternatives that we talked about.
And don't underestimate the power of your voice. Contact your elected officials. Let them know that you care about this issue. Vote for candidates who prioritize environmental protection and public health. And make informed choices as a consumer. Support businesses that are committed to sustainability and PFAS-free products.
Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference. This isn't just a problem for scientists and policymakers to solve. It's an issue that affects all of us, and we all have a role to play.
Well said. This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like we've learned so much about the pervasiveness of these chemicals, the potential health risks, and how complex finding solutions is. But one thing is crystal clear, this is not an issue we can afford to ignore.
Yeah, I completely agree. The fight against forever chemicals is far from over. But I am hopeful that with continued research, stronger regulations, and collective action, we can create a healthier and safer future for all of us.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, we leave you with this final thought. What role will you play in the fight against PFAS? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives on timely and relevant topics. Thanks for joining us.